A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps, because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. You know what stood out for me tonight?
What stood out?
When defeat came, so did our depression. Such an interesting concept, isn't it? That if things don't go the way that I want them to, that without having any other possibilities in hand, that I just get disheartened and depressed.
Yeah.
And we talk about that all the time. It's like, in our society, man, not being successful or quote failing, quote unquote, right? Or being disappointed is somehow bad.
Yeah.
It's like that we are, I know for me, I felt bad about myself if I fail. Like there's something defective in me.
If my voice quivers.
Yeah. If I show any weakness.
Yeah.
And look at the trap that creates for you and I, right? Is that this idea that, as he said at other points of this thing, these perfectionist specifications, right? These ideas I have about how I am supposed to be okay, become an impossible way of life. I mean, they really do, man. And I know that, and you know that. We've talked about how we suffer that terribly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This poet I likes compared it to the moon and saying I'll only go out on the nights when the moon is full. It's like I'll only like myself when everything is just
Right.
so right. But there's all these days of the year where it's not full.
Oh, how many days, right? That's more. You're right. That's great. I love that. I love that metaphor.
Me too.
That's great. Well, thank you again. Okay. Well, I will pass the baton over to Herb tonight, and he's going to take us into a discussion of not taking things personal.
What do you mean by that?
I did. It's so true, right? It's like, God, we do this all the time, right? It's like so funny. Oh my God. You weren't here last week, and I take it personal. My God.
Well,
Especially
when I told you I forgot, you could take that.
It's like, God's sake, my narcissism just went right.
Oh my gosh. And
you know what? It's wonderful to have you here tonight, Herb.
Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to be here. The chapter 6 is entitled Not Taking It Personally. What's it? Reality. It's such a simple concept, and yet it's such a profound awareness and experience. I did not have it. I did not know it. I could not have articulated it in any way that would have actually been experiential. There may have been some academic ways I could have approached it, but not from an actual experience personally connected to it, that's where I'm coming from tonight. I was 5 years sober before I was able to hear somebody who actually had an experience. I call it thawing out sufficiently, a story for another day, to actually hear somebody who had an experience, different vocabulary, different tones, different look in his eye, but especially a difference in the resonance in his voice. And it was like he became my North Star. I mean, I don't know how to actually, there was a magnetic kind of like turning. It was immediate, it was shocking, it was stunning. And fortunately, he agreed to help me. What I didn't know is that I didn't know, despite all the information I had. And just to review the chapters, and I did it while we were opening up tonight, I thought, well, what's the context of chapter 6? You know, chapter 1 is about being asleep. I'm using my words. Chapter 2 is about awakening. For the purpose of chapter 3, emotional sobriety, which is a description, and the key, and we've talked about it in self-esteem, one of the key pillars of self-esteem, and it's probably the key pillar here in the emotional sobriety, and that's conscious, to be conscious, which then leads us to chapter 5, which is about being aware. Consciousness is different than awareness. Consciousness is our ability to be aware. But awareness is actually a gift of the development of it as a function. And then we become aware that about reality itself. And based on just the way we started today, I was thinking, as Declan read and as Dr. Berger introduced the time tonight, we hear all the time, should, fair, supposed to, expectation, and my favorite is story. We all have a story. Some of us know we have a story. Most of the people I encounter early in recovery or early in waking up, even if they're 10 or 20 years in recovery, they don't know they have a story, but it's the lens through which they look. And if the lens is distorted, what they see will be distorted based on the lens of my beliefs, the lens of my attitude, the lens of my motives, the lens of the knowledge that I have, real information or misinformation, the opinions that I've developed over time, the prejudgments, translate prejudice, that I have, the distortions that I have that I don't know that I have, or that I even know that I have, but I'm pretty convinced I'm right. These are all the things that were revealed to, well, over time, not all at once, in doing a 4-step inventory. And, you know, we've talked about the instincts a lot. I base my whole inventory process, you know, unpacking step 4 in the big book and the 12 and 12 on the biological and psychological instincts of fight, flight, and freeze. It's perfect to help us unpack the survival instincts that we have at the basic survival level, but then they get refined at the emotional level for beyond safety to satisfaction, and then even beyond that to the social, I like alliteration, safety, satisfaction, social connection at the highest level of community, and all for survival, to be part of, to feel safe. And in order to feel safe and part of the community, clearly we need to feel valued, otherwise we're ostracized. The one thing that people really punished people with was banishment from the community, because you leave the community and you go out into the wilderness, you're going to die. So one of the points that Alan made, I reread it today, is we talk about it all the time, but he put it in different vocabulary. He talked about the first voice and the second voice. The first voice is my reaction coming from stimulus response at the biological level. Stimulus response. Reaction, actually. Stimulus reaction. Whereas the second voice he used, talked about emotional sobriety, is the stimulus and response, where there's that pause. We get particularly adept at that if we understand and embrace the step 10, which is to watch for these stimuli of emotions. Bill says in the big book, when they crop up. He doesn't say if they crop up. And there's the signals. I love it, the terminology here. It's not in the big book, but it's the discussions that we have. These emotions, they're not right or wrong. They're biochemical reactions to the stimulus and my interpretation of the stimulus, or the external, whatever the area of stimulation is. My interpretation through my lenses determines the energy that comes from the emotions. And then if in fact I'm conscious enough and aware enough of this dynamic and practiced enough over time, I can pause. The longer the pause, the better the response, because there's a consciousness, there's an awareness, there's a remembrance of the mistakes I made and or the success that I had when in fact I took different actions other than the ones that are viscerally tied to the stimulus at the animal level, the unconscious level. So one of the concepts that came to me as I was reading it today was we don't take reality personally. We do take how we react to reality personally. What we react to is not personal. Reality itself, I love the term flow. There's an evolution. I mean, really Darwinian concept, evolution. Everything is evolving, generating or degenerating, integrating or disintegrating. It's a constant flow. We're in a river of reality, and it's constantly, moment to moment to moment to moment, everything is changing. And the way we can balance our lives in terms of managing our emotions is to be very conscious of the stimulus that we have, the perceptions that we have, to evaluate our beliefs and our motives and our attitudes, to keep in mind what outcomes we want. The point of the self-esteem, the process that we've used in our sequencing of the books for me has been very powerful. Is about that self-esteem. When I had low self-esteem, I needed to create a compensating system for me to be powerful, or to be, my safety mechanisms was to be grandiose, to overcompensate in that way, that fight mechanism. And and then once I did the inventory and began to see that actually it wasn't because I thought so well of myself that I performed the way I did. It was actually because I was compensating for how much I didn't feel competent, didn't feel connected, didn't feel a part of, didn't feel a value of, didn't feel approved, didn't feel belonged. I mean, quite frankly, I still have some parts in me, that shadow in me. When I walk in, I'm 40 years sober almost. I keep saying it's February, but when I walk into an AA meeting, I'm still not sure I'm a part of the community. I still really don't wear it as comfortably as I would a comfortable shirt. It's still, there's an awareness that I'm different. And I hear it so many times from people who talk about their experience of addiction, of course, and then of recovery, that I must be from a different planet, or I'm just, they have the formula, I don't have the formula. One of the points Dr. Berger makes, Roger makes, is that feelings are not facts, though. I never even thought about it until I began becoming conscious and awake and practicing what we're talking about here. The step 10, which I believe is a wonderful tool of emotional sobriety, because it guides us. Principles that we studied originally in terms of the steps are the guidelines and guardrails. And now I operate on those. When I'm disturbed, the word Bill uses in the 12 and 12 in step 10. And my counsel to others is determine what the principle is. What's the principle? What struck me when Declan was reading was the term humility. Now, it gets a bad rap. What it really means, one of the authors that I read said, is humility is truth. Such a simple definition. It's the truth of recognizing reality and my place in it. I am not the center of the universe. That was news to me when I did the fourth step, that I even had thought that delusional thought. But I am the center of my reality. And again, Dr. Berger talks about keeping the center of our reality deep inside ourselves and not putting it in people, not putting it in circumstances, not putting it in events, but keeping that deep inside myself, where whether I believe it or not, I act as if I actually do have value from the inside. And once I begin acting that way, I begin thinking that way, I begin feeling that way. It's counterintuitive, but most of any spiritual or religious or therapeutic teacher talks that way. Knowledge doesn't change me, and feelings don't change me, and desire doesn't change me. What changes me is action. And when I take the action, my thinking improves. And when I take the action, my feelings improve. And with improved thinking and improved feelings, my actions improve. The benefit of the Serenity Prayer, for instance. Such a powerful prayer for emotional sobriety. What can I influence? What can't I influence? What can I influence? I don't control anything. No, seriously. I jettisoned the word control 30 years ago when I did this work, because I could see the truth of it. I don't control even myself. I don't control my breath, my heartbeat. I certainly don't control the traffic. I don't control, but I influence. And what do I influence? Damn little, outside of me and inside of me. But the point is the pause to allow me to understand what I do influence. And there's the wisdom. Wisdom comes from my making a lot of mistakes, not taking it personally, saying that we all learned if we're awake during these sessions. We don't take our mistakes personally. We own them. I made a mistake, doesn't name me. And I hopefully will learn from it as I practice living, correcting the mistake. I call it course correction. And as I practice course correction, I make fewer mistakes, less gross mistakes. I make better and more effective corrections, and my life smooths out, and I have the shock absorbers to handle the speed bumps. And I say it without getting embarrassed anymore. I haven't really suffered in 30 plus years. I'm serious. Oh, have I had pain? Well, anybody who knows my personal history knows there's been lots of pain, but not suffering. Once I had these tools and began to practice this way of life in terms of taking full responsibility for my behavior, for my thoughts, for my feelings, and for the outcomes of that behavior. And if I didn't get the outcomes, then to evaluate. So how do I get better outcomes that bring me joy? How do I get less outcomes that bring me suffering? The two things that most of the books on happiness talk about. I mean, this is a distillation of lots of scientific research or philosophical speculation or psychological observations. If you want to be happy, embrace joy and avoid suffering. That was the conclusion in one of the books from Harvard. Thank you, Mr. Harvard. Really, embrace joy and avoid suffering. It's that simple. Well, but it's not easy, of course. So I'll conclude with in Declan's comments about reading the entire article deserve some real consideration here, because there's a piece in there that I found extremely helpful, and it's a paragraph on the healing circuit. And Bill says, when I am loved, then I experience being lovable. And when I'm experiencing being lovable, totally contrary to my upbringing and my belief at the core level, not a conscious thing, then I'm capable of loving. And once I can express and act loving, then of course I'm more lovable. And that's the healing circuit. And I think he puts it in the spirit, as I recall, he puts it in, Bill Wilson puts it in the spiritual context, when we realize, one of my teachers calls it, that we have a core of goodness. We individual, each human being essentially has a core of goodness. That is that spark of the divine that the poets talk about, that piece of the mystery that the philosophers talk about, that soul or that life force that Dr. Berger talks about in us, that deep true self, higher self that the Buddhists talk about. And when I can tap into that and then behave accordingly, even if I don't believe it, somehow it becomes real. I tap into the truth of it. And then as I practice it, I manifest it, I reveal it. The healing circuit, a process, not an event, a process. It took lots of time, the thawing out, and then the practice of the principles and of the program and of prayer and meditation and of service to others and all of the things that you've all heard about if you're in a 12-step program. So I'm very grateful for all of this. Thanks, guys.
Raj, why don't you kick us off if you wouldn't mind, and then.
Sure. Yeah. Herb, that was a problematic presentation. You gave me way too many things to think about, man, and to respond to. Especially so tonight, for me, at least. I really am not sure where to begin. As I've said many times, as I find my way to a beginning, I guess, in my life today at age 74, I still go through so many of the same thoughts and the same emotional reactions and the same actions at times as I did in earlier decades of my life. But the difference is I've gotten better at that pause process that you just described, Herb. I don't act out the parts of me that create trouble for me in my life as much as I used to. I don't say the things that create trouble for me in my life as much as I used to. And that's the second voice that, Alan, you talk about in this chapter. When you talked about humility, Alan and I are big tennis fans, and I haven't played for a number of years, but for many years we played together and against each other and so on. And there's a famous tennis player named Roger Federer. And when you think about humility, I remember in press conferences after matches, I would be so impressed because Roger, when he was asked questions about the match, he would just say, well, I think I did this really well. And he would detail the 2 or 3 things he thinks he did really well during the match. And then he would say, and I didn't do as well as I'd hoped in some other areas. And he was just very matter of fact about it. But the thing that was so striking was the absence of ego in how he talked about his performance. There's a sportsmanship award among tennis professionals, and a guy named Stefan Edberg is actually named for him, had very much that same quality. Not artificially or unnecessarily self-effacing or self-dismissing, and not grandiose at all, not self-aggrandizing. And that to me is what you just said, Herb. Humility is being aligned with reality. Being aligned with reality. Just being willing to speak the truth and hopefully be aware of our own ego needs enough, because from my perspective, we all have them and they will show up many times throughout our day, where we can, what I like to call, decline the invitation, decline the invitation of certain parts of ourselves, that if we know what we know and are able to know what we know in that moment, will help steady us, will help us, stay more centered and more calm. And that to me is a big part of taking other people's behavior less personally, because I still do it all the time. I begin to do it more often than I actually do it in terms of acting it out or letting it control my speech, my words. But gosh, the impulse to take other people's behavior personally is very strong in me still at times. I want to submit another idea, and you actually mentioned it, Herb. Something I talk with my clients about sometimes is the problems it creates for us when we take our own behavior too personally. We talk a lot about the problems it creates when we make ourselves the center point of other people's behavior, and therefore go through a lot of emotional reactions and storytelling in our heads and confusion regarding other people. But we do all these same things to ourselves. We blame ourselves. We show a lack of empathy or compassion toward ourselves. We don't take our own history into account at all in terms of how the crucial role that is played for all of us in helping form who we are in our lives, where we take all those shoulds that we absorb, often I believe with positive intentions from our moms and dads and other significant others in our life, and we don't allow ourselves to become conscious of the influence of all of that on our behavior, and therefore have more ability to not only show compassion toward our behavior, but to learn from it. So Alan, you talk about if we want to get more personal with other people, we need to take their behavior less personally, right? And that makes a lot of sense. But the same can be true with ourselves. If we want to have a more personal kind of connection to ourselves, we need to become aware of all the self-blaming and all the shoulding and all the criticism and judgment, the lack of empathy, the lack of compassion, the lack of appreciation of the context that we each come from, and the formative effect that has had on each one of us, to go like, I'm not where I'd like to be, but compared to where I was when I first arrived at legal adulthood, and given more deeply I understand the forces that were forming me from the moment I was born, even prenatally, but the moment I was born to the point of 18 or 21, I've come quite a ways. I have a lot to appreciate and value in myself, and I'm, there are ways I feel that way for myself. There are ways I don't necessarily feel that way in some areas of my life for myself. But I'm urging everyone to think about that the more we understand about the factors that we have been subjected to in our upbringing and all the messages we've received, both positive and negative, and how much we've internalized those messages and continue to function from those messages in our lives today, a lot of our behavior becomes immediately and deeply understandable, right? If we really grasp it, if we really look back and remember. And then it can become a lot easier to forgive ourselves, from my perspective, and become more accepting of ourselves. And then it becomes a lot easier to change. And I also like what you said, Herb, because it's not just one way. It's not that we just have to learn and gain insight, and then with that awareness, we start to feel differently, and then we're able to take different action. Sometimes that does happen. I've been subjected to thoughts and books and people talking with me that have led me to want to change my behavior,
Right.
for sure. But other times it's been the change in my behavior, as you were talking about, that's led to those other changes. So I also want to impress that upon everybody. There is not one pathway
Right.
to change, to becoming more aligned with my best self, or at least my better self in my behavior in my life. So gosh, Herb, I well, you said it always is, but so rich and so personal tonight. So thank you very much, man. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Sure.
Yeah, Raj, I love how you extended that and started relating it to how we are in a relationship with ourselves. See, it's very important, and Bill even says that, and when he's defining emotional sobriety, is bringing humility in our relationship with ourselves, with others, and with God, right? Of our understanding. We also have included, life, right? Looking at our relationship with life, and you can take all those things personally.
Yeah.
We could take, look at what God is doing to me. I mean, we were right. I mean, we take it. I'm that important. My God, look at what God is doing. God is punishing me.
Right.
Those kinds of things. So we can apply it. You're right. That can be something that shows up. What I wanted to emphasize tonight, and I'll be talking about this more next week when we wrap up this chapter, is just the fact that we've looked at a lot of the influences that create taking things personally, right? We've talked about that we grow up in a culture that is that perpetuates narcissism, right? It's an all about me culture is the way to think about this. And there's no question about it that this culture creates that kind of focus on self. We see it's very strong in our culture. But we cannot underestimate also the influence that our emotional dependency contributes to taking things personally. Yeah. See, if I am so dependent on my environment for support, and include in my environment all the things we just talked about, relationships with people, relationship with life, relationship with myself, right? If I'm so dependent on that being a certain way for me to be okay, then of course I'm going to be very vigilant about any signs that things are out of alignment with what I think I need to be okay. Bill even said that at one point. He said it was so articulated so well. There was never enough of what I thought I needed. There was never enough. And there can't be enough when what we need is so based on outside of ourselves. Herb, what you said before about the healing circuit, it's so true and apropos here to our discussion. But let's not forget that the role that emotional dependency plays in all of this stuff, that's really the culprit that we've been trying to identify. And as you said, Herb, there is a method to my madness in terms of how I wrote these insights. The first one was waking up from our sleepwalking. The second one was now trying to live consciously, right? And then the third one was discerning our emotional dependency, which is taking that consciousness and using it to have an awareness of our overdependence on the environment for support. That's what we're looking at. And now we're seeing another manifestation of what that overdependence on our environment for support means in terms of taking things personally. We're constantly scanning. I like the way that Nathaniel Branden says it. We're constantly looking for approval or disapproval. We're either looking for someone approving us or we're going to get the disapproval. And in both cases, it's related to our emotional dependency. So this has been a great discussion tonight. And Herb,
And what you're talking about, Alan, is the practice.
That's right.
There's the key word. We practice emotional sobriety. We practice consciousness. We practice correcting mistakes.
practice awareness. We practice really trying to focus our awareness on things. And so this has been great. And, you know, I just love how we're really, you know, really chewing up these chapters and digesting them well, because that's how we learn from this stuff, is you chew it up and you really let it, you take from it what's really going to grow you, and you just let go of the rest. So thank you. And then we can open this up for some sharing on not taking things personally. And what those of you out there that are listening to us have kind of learning yourselves about this.
Thank you, Herb, for kicking us off tonight, and Alan and Roger for your comments. You know, the one thing which I picked up on, Herb, was you talked about a relationship with reality, and what was, you know, in humility. And what was kicking in my mind is several times in Bill's writing, and especially in the 12 on 12, he talks about accurate self-assessment, accurate self-serving. That word accurate is carrying a lot of weight, because I did not come from accuracy. I came from a lot of deceit, and I came from a lot of covering up, and it wasn't until I went through the work and got some practice in that I started to align my perception with reality, and at that point, then I could move into humility, because I was seeing myself accurately. And
Right.
yeah, I really appreciate that. And then one other thing about this practice is, and a friend of mine were talking about this last week, because we're doing some work in Don Miguel Ruiz's book, is if I do fall into a spot of taking things personally, to not beat myself up over it. So I said, don't take it personal if I wind up taking things personally. Just recognize it happens, and pick it up and go from there.
But see, that's true humility right there. You're not defending, you're observing and adjusting. Yeah.
I love this practice.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.